Hi, it's Pastor Andy with our Monday video, and today we're talking about the true Israel. In Romans 9 through 11, Paul is dealing with a couple of issues, and the primary issue is that he wants to show the people of Israel that God is faithful, that God has not abandoned his promises to the people. But there's a related issue that is important here, and that is that the people of Israel do have a place in God's plan. And a part of that issue is addressed in the first portion of Romans 9. And the question that we could ask really is, who is Israel? But before I share Paul's argument, let me attack this from a little bit of a different approach first. In 70 AD, Rome conquered Jerusalem, and for all practical purposes, Israel ceased to exist as a nation, as a defined sovereign nation with borders and such. And that was true until it was reinstated as a nation, which happened in May 1948, after the United Nations had a resolution that allowed for that. But so for a period of a little over 1,870 years, actually almost 1,880 years, the nation that we call Israel today was lumped together within a larger territory, a larger group of people called Palestine and the Palestinians. But the people who descended from the ancestors of ancient Israel, going all the way back to Abraham, they were still people of Israel, even though they didn't have their own homeland, a nation, a sovereign nation like Israel. That is, they were still a part of ethnic Israel, even though they weren't a part of national Israel. And so, even though the country might not have been there, their heritage remained. Now, that understanding might help, I hope it helps us to connect the challenge that Paul faced in his day, although it's a different challenge altogether. See, Israel began when God made a covenant with Abraham. Then through Isaac and eventually through Jacob, God continued that covenant with the people, even as they were slaves in Egypt, as he called them out of Egypt, as he led them into the promised land, as they rebelled against him. And over time, we see that God continues to be faithful to them, even as they abandon him and return. And ultimately, that abandonment meant that the 10 northern tribes of Israel were taken captive by Assyria in approximately 722 BC or so. And then another 140 years later, or thereabouts, the Babylonians came in and captured the southern kingdom, the southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. But God did not forget his people overall. And eventually, Israel would be restored. They would have their nation again, in a sense, even though foreign nations such as Rome occupied them and harassed them greatly for a period of years. But ethnic Israel was always preserved. We see that in Esther in a miraculous form. We see that they returned to the promised land through, say, Ezra and Nehemiah, and all that those leaders did to help Israel to be reinstated all the way through 70 AD. But again, even through all of that time, the people remained as the people of Israel. Ethnic Israel was still real. And ethnic Israel knew that God was for Israel and claimed God's promises for themselves. Again, they didn't have a nation, so we are the people of Israel. God promised us something, and we're going to claim it. But the problem was that they did not make a distinction between their ethnicity and their spirituality. In Romans 4, Paul showed that Abraham was justed not by what he did, getting circumcised, being one, and second, offering his son Isaac as an offering, as a sacrifice. Rather, as Romans 4:3 says, in quoting Genesis 15:6, he was justified, it was credited to him as righteousness because of his faith. So most Israelites, and later the Jews, all the way through the time of Paul, claimed that their ethnic heritage was the way for salvation. Just because they were of the bloodline, the descendants of Abraham through his DNA, so to speak, they were indeed children of Abraham. They were saved by God. But justification, which is the beginning of salvation, Paul shows that clearly throughout Romans, that it does not come from our lineage, it comes from faith. So to further this argument in Romans 9, Paul shows that not everyone that descended from Abraham was really was able to benefit from the covenant promise. Not everyone who descended from Abraham was really, truly Israel. We see this beginning in verse 6. Ishmael and Isaac. It was Isaac. Jacob and Esau. It was Jacob. And over time, Paul is making the argument that true Israel is not based upon ethnicity. It's not based upon the bloodline of Abraham. It is based upon faith. Verse 8. So again, consider the nation of Israel, if you will. It did not formally exist as a nation from 70 AD, when Rome conquered Jerusalem, through 1948, after the UN had reinstated it. But the people could still be Israel. And in a similar vein, the true people of Israel do not have to be from the physical offering. They don't have to be of the physical bloodline, just like the people of Israel, the ethnic people of Israel, did not have to live in a certain area. The true Israel, the spiritual Israel, did not have to descend directly from a person. It was by his faith and the example of his faith that we now embrace that makes us, who are Christian, those who follow Jesus, the true Israel today. Now, bloodlines do matter. And those who carry the DNA of Abraham are still important to God in some way that the Bible doesn't completely elaborate on to help to satisfy our curiosity. But however the ethnic Israel is still cared for by God, it is different than the spiritual Israel is for those who have faith in God, regardless of our nationality, how we are cared for by God as we are the children of God, as Paul has used a few times in Romans 8. Again, bloodlines matter. But for the ethnic Israel, they banked on the blood that was flowing through them that had been passed down from their descendant Abraham. But the true blood that matters is the blood that ran down from Jesus that covers over our sins. That is faith. That is what it means to be a descendant of Abraham. That is what it means to be a true person of Israel. That is what it means to be a child of God.